Welcome to Young Americans for Liberty Live, Episode 1, Defend the Guard. This is a show where we're going to break down for you periodically what's happening in the news. Joining me today is Brandon Steinhauser. Welcome to the show, Brandon.
Good to be on the show.
So there was a pretty out there tweet that was put up recently that we want to go over for you guys. So Kevin Barron said Trump at the America First Summit just called for federal power to send the National Guard to restore, and this is a quote, send the National Guard to, quote, restore order and secure the peace without having to wait for the approval of some governors that think it's politically incorrect to call them in. And then the crowd applauded. So we want to dig into that, like the nuance of it. Is this a good move? Is this a bad move? What would the repercussions be? So Brendan, you are a member of the Texas State Guard, if I remember correctly.
I am
second lieutenant?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, that tweet definitely got my attention.
Yeah, definitely. And, I was active duty Army infantry. So we both probably have some pretty serious opinions about this. So what do you think? What's your first reactions to this, Brendan?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, kind of an indicator that Trump was thinking about his presidency, and he was thinking about civil unrest, in 2020 in particular, what was going on in the cities. And then, of course, he was also probably thinking about January 6th and the events leading up to that. So, he was basically thinking, if I become president again, I want to have the power to basically go around the governors that opposed me politically and opposed me in what I wanted to do with, sitting in the National Guard and potentially invoking the Insurrection Act to send active duty forces as well and sort of overturn posse comitatus, if you will, so that active duty law can perform law enforcement. And so I think that's where his head is at. And so I think that when I saw that tweet, that's kind of the psychoanalysis that I did of him, whether right or wrong. But I think that's what he's thinking is when I'm back in power, I don't want to have to deal with these pesky governors and, their power over the National and state guards across the country.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw this, kind of like you, the first thing that I thought of was Portland back in 2020 when he sent in, Border Patrol, their BORTAC, their Special Operations Unit, and he was calling for the National Guard to go in. Like, something needed to be done about that situation. It was a riot, but is usurping the governors, giving more power to the executive branch, really the right decision? I mean, we've seen what's happened with that with when Congress ceded their power to declare war to the executive branch. And now we're in what's going on it's over 20 years now that we've been in the global war on terror. And it didn't stay confined to Afghanistan and Iraq. It spread out to Libya, Somalia, Syria. We've got operations in the Philippines. So what do you think the effects of that would be? How bad do you think that would be?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, it's kind of a violation of the intent of National Guard and state guard forces around the country, right? The idea of a well-regulated militia, it not only includes our official, state forces, but you and I have talked about this too. It also includes citizens being prepared and ready to defend their homeland, defend the country, and sometimes to be a check on tyrannical government as well. And so I think if you were to pursue this sort of thing, you basically, put more power in the federal government. You put more power specifically in the presidency. And you kind of make the president just one step closer to being a king. That's not the way this was intended. I think it's the absolute wrong approach. And there's plenty of law enforcement, around the country to deal with what happened in 2020. And certainly you could call out the National Guard, and he did in a lot of places. But to say that the governors are not the first commanders in chief of these forces goes against the spirit of the law, goes against the Constitution, and also over 200 years of American history. You and I have talked about this a lot where, originally the colonists, even before there was a country, the colonists were expected to carry arms and be prepared to defend their homes, their communities against, foreign aggression, foreign militaries, against their enemies domestically, and also potentially a tyrannical government, which they ended up doing in the Revolution of 1776.
Oh, 100%. That's the entire point of the Second Amendment, was for us to be able to defend ourselves against any threat. So how do you think, what is the best way that we can go about limiting this so that we don't get, if, say, this became a thing, this executive power to usurp governors on the National Guard deployments, what do you think the best way to counter that so we don't have some self-appointed king deciding where to send the troops inside the United States.
Yeah, I think we need to first and foremost educate people and make sure they understand the history of these state forces of what are called Title 32 forces. In other words, Title 32 of the U.S. Code, which outlines the role that these state militaries play. And yes, there's also Title 10, which is when they are federalized under the president. But first and foremost, they are state forces. They're paid for by the state. They're armed and equipped by the state. They're deployed by the state, mostly for things like natural disasters, right? And to some degree also homeland security, homeland defense, but it's mostly floods, fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, disaster response and recovery. And I think that should be the first mission of these forces. So reminding Americans that this is what these forces were created to do, in addition to the other duties we talked about, and to be a check on federal power, I think is important. Secondarily, I think that there are certainly legislative approaches also, and I think I'm going to kind of throw the question back to you because I know this is something you're passionate about, but there is an effort across the country to pass what's called the Defend the Guard Act, which would put some real limitations on the federal call up of these forces. So I know you wrote actually recently in our Young Americans for Liberty magazine called The American Revolution about the Defend the Guard Act. So I'm going to throw that question back to you. Tell us about the Defend the Guard Act and what it would do.
So basically, the Defend the Guard Act is, if it gets passed, it's a bill that would make it to where without a congressional declaration of war, it is illegal to send the National Guard into combat zones. During the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq specifically, about 40% at any given time of our deployed combat forces were from the National Guard. Whether that was support roles, like your S-shop dudes or the guys that hand out the ammo, or if it's your infantry guys and your National Guard Special Forces dudes from 19th and 20th Group. 40% of all deployed manpower came from that, which was never the intent of the National Guard, like you talked about. Or like if you trace the lineage of the National Guard, it goes back to the militias that we had in this country in the earliest days. And it wasn't until the war on terror that we decided that they need to be used as an external military force instead of something domestically to respond to emergencies. So if we could pass Defend the Guard Act, what's going to happen is first, we're going to restrict the federal government's ability to make war. If you take away 40% of their manpower, essentially half of the rifles in the fight are gone. So they're going to have to be a lot more selective about which fights we get into. And at the same time, you're going to be also going along with that 10th Amendment thing and restoring power to the state governors. With the global war on terror, with the AUMF and all that, it kind of took that away from it. The states did not have the ability to tell the federal government, like, no, that's not what our forces are for. They were forced and compelled into sending their young overseas to die in a war that we had no place in. So I think it's a great move. And I think with something like this, it would also help there, because if we pass Defend the Guard Act, you can't use the state's troops. Say, you're from Wyoming, right? And Wyoming has Defend the Guard Act, and a president comes in, whoever it may be, whatever party, and they want to use those troops to put down something they see as a threat, whether it's legitimately a threat or not, and they decide to just go around the governor. Well, you can't do that with the Defend the Guard Act because it is now up to the governor wholly, unless there is a congressionally declared war. And I don't think you're going to be able to get Congress to declare war on American citizens anytime soon.
Yeah, it's another big check on getting involved in foreign conflicts, right? So it's an added check. And frankly, we haven't declared a war, I think, since probably World War II, the declaration of war against Japan and then Germany. So we haven't really used, that proper authority. And frankly, Congress has really abdicated its responsibility on that very question. But to your point about using National Guard troops in the global war on terror, I remember reading a lot of reports, especially kind of, as the Iraq war dragged on, about just the impact that made on those families and those communities, because a lot of these folks who are in the Guard, they have their full-time professional lives, they often have families, and active duty, troops do as well. But especially in the Guard, they tend to be a little older. They tend to be, they have full-time jobs, civilian jobs, and they do their Guard service on the weekend, in addition to some annual training and things like that. Look, they fully expect at some point to be called up to do something, but usually that's been, again, natural disasters more than anything. And
Mhm.
so certainly it has happened in the past where they've been called, to send abroad, to fight foreign wars. But that's really not the purpose of the Guard. And I think that during the last 20 years, you've seen, a lot of reports about what impact that made on these soldiers, on the families, and on their communities. It was a real, blow to them. And it's different when you have active duty soldiers who, they are professional soldiers. They sign up, you know, they know what they're getting into in a full time capacity, right? And so people make those choices. Those choices are a little different when it comes to the Guard. So I think the Defend the Guard Act, I think, would be a huge check on federal power. It would sort of restore the purpose of, state military forces, and it would kind of force Congress to do its job because, frankly, it's failed for the last, 75 plus years.
Yep, 100%. I mean, you're right. World War II is the last time there was a federally declared war, and we've since then we've had Korea, Vietnam, we had Panama, Grenada, then the war on terror, and not to mention Iraq One. I Why are we sending these? Like, we have a constitution. When you enlist, I don't know what you guys swore in the Texas State Guard, but for us, it was I swear to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, both foreign and domestic.
Same, plus the Texas
When
Constitution.
All right, so basically the same thing. But now, when Congress is just going around that and saying, it's not popular to vote to send people's kids to fight, so we're just going to hand that off to the executive. That's, to me, that's a slap in the face. Like, we're here promising to lay down our lives if necessary to fight for the Constitution, but they choose for political purposes to give up their obligation. Like, to me, that just doesn't sit right.
Yeah, and again, the Congress is a little more, in fact, a lot more accountable than the president is, right? I mean, these individual Congress members represent districts. They're closer to the people. People have more of an impact with them. You actually can find these, members of Congress more easily, in the community. It's easier to go visit their offices and tell them what you think about potentially getting involved in a foreign conflict. Whereas with the president, they're elected every 4 years. They're totally cut off from the people. They kind of live in their little isolated bubble in the West Wing. Often we've seen all sorts of accounts of that, frankly, over the last 2 centuries. So they're just less accountable to the people. Whereas, I will say I saw this happen when we were looking at getting involved in Syria, and President Obama kind of drew his red line and said, if the Syrians, use chemical weapons, that's my red line, and we're going to take action. And again, there's some dispute over whether and how much that happened, whether that red line was crossed or not. But I will tell you, at the time, I remember, people across the country rising up and saying, if he did that, that's horrific. If Assad did that, it's a horrible thing. It's tragic. It's horrific. It's terrible. But we didn't necessarily sign on to, President Obama making that decision. And so members of Congress heard from their constituents about that all over the country. It happened very fast, very quickly. And actually, most of the members of Congress basically said, we're not gonna do this. We're not going to support you or give you the authorization to do that. And frankly, democracy, that's kind of democracy in action. And we're not a democracy as much as a republic, but that is the democratic side of things kind of working in terms of foreign policy. And frankly, I think that's a healthy thing because, to your point, the very people who are, sent abroad in search of monsters to destroy, to paraphrase John Quincy Adams, are sons and daughters of America, and they're represented by Congress.
Hmm. And we kind of see the same thing going on right now with the war in Ukraine, as we saw in Syria, right? There's certain people that are saber rattling. They're trying to drag us into a war, but there's a lot of Americans around the country that are saying, no, we don't want to go. That is a European conflict. It's a regional conflict between, honestly, two of the most corrupt governments in Europe. There's no reason for the United States to get involved. We've just got out of the longest war in our history. Why do we want to get dragged into another one that's going to be worse? Like, this is a standing army. We haven't really trained to fight a standing army for the last 20 years. Like, we don't have an appetite as a country for that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty clear from all the polling that I've seen. It's bipartisan in terms of public opinion to say we need to try and stay out of that conflict. There might be more support maybe for providing, training or weapons or things like that from certain folks, but for anybody that wants to, declare a no-fly zone or wants to actually get our, put ourselves in a situation where we are in a hot war with Russia that has very little support in this country. And the more that we do, the more likely we are to get involved in a conflict. I mean, that's the thing that we have to be really careful about. So yes, we are arming the Ukrainian opposition. Yes, we are doing a lot of training. We have a lot of partnerships. In fact, our National Guard troops have a lot of partnerships with the Ukrainians, with the Poles, with others in Europe. It's part of a longstanding program. That's all well and good, but that's very different than sending American troops to Ukraine to fight, or sending them to Russia. Certainly, this is a conflict that is, again, horrific and tragic, and in my opinion, you know Vladimir Putin kind of launched this war to achieve his ends, and was unprovoked and unjustified. But I think for those that want to have that fight, any Americans that want to fight that fight, I tell you what, the Ukrainians are signing up volunteers as we see from all over the world. So for folks that think we should be getting in there, you certainly have the right to do that. But I think it's another question when you're talking about the United States getting involved in that conflict.
Yeah, 100%. Like, if you want to go fight, feel free, have fun. Join the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. I'm sure you'll have a great time with that. But, like the US, personally, I don't think that we should even be providing aid. Like, if you think about this from the other side, imagine that the United States was in a war with Mexico, right? And Russia started pumping guns, ammo, bombs, and, advisors. That's one of the most recent calls, that they want us to send advisors into Ukraine. Imagine if they started pumping that into Mexico, if we were at war with Mexico. To the American people, to our government, that would, they'd be signaling that they're in the war. They're drawing themselves in, they're giving support to one side, they're choosing a winner here. I don't think the American people would be very happy with that. So why do we expect the Russian people to be fine with our actions in that direction?
It's funny you mentioned Mexico. There's a great kind of historical example there, looking back to the 19 teens and into World War
Zimmerman
One,
telegram.
basically, right? Exactly. So the U.S. had a pretty fraught relationship with Mexico. We were chasing Pancho Villa and other folks. A lot of violence along the Mexican Texas border, and President Woodrow Wilson, was sort of sending out these expeditions, including General John Pershing, to go, into Mexico. So there was a bad relationship there, but yeah, the Germans basically reached out to Mexico and said, join us and help us fight the Americans. We'll help you, take back your lost land in the Southwest. And of course, as you said, the Zimmerman telegram was decoded, and it's one of the, I guess, probably the three, two or three key causes of American involvement in the war, in addition to the sinking of the Lusitania, and also just the Germans, doing unrestricted U-boat attacks in general. So yeah, I mean, it's a good parallel example, looking at history and looking at elevate very quickly. They can escalate very quickly, and all of a sudden, you can find yourself at war. And I think what's different now, and what has everybody kind of with an added sense of caution and concern, is the fact that you have nuclear powers involved, right, including the United States and Russia, among others. So it gets really really tough really quickly. But again, I think all of this goes back to, we need to have a republic where Congress, as representatives of the people, declare wars. Yes, the president is the commander in chief. They basically, run the war once it's declared. But Congress has totally failed in this, and I think this is why defend the guard is more important than ever.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting. Like, what is it? It's the javelins that we sent over. It's something like 60-70% of our current stockpile. When I was living down in South Alabama, I got a job offer to work over at Lockheed building those javelins, which is pretty funny. But to me, like, when I see something like that, we're getting such a massive amount of these, so we're going to have to replenish our supply. I feel like there's something on the back end there. General Smedley Butler, he said after World War One, he spent 35 years, I think, in the military. He said that war is a racket, that the reason that we get involved in so many conflicts isn't for the benefit of our country. It's not for the benefit of the people, definitely, especially the ones that are fighting it. It's for the benefit of the companies, So what do you think about that? Do you think that that's playing a role in this?
I definitely think that has an impact. And if you look at where we're, doing certain things, like where we have military bases, what they're building, right? The types of things that we're selling to foreign countries, a lot of that is basically pork barrel spending by Congress. And I've heard people, in the military talk about this, right? What we really need to be doing is building these other systems or these types of planes or that type of equipment. But because Congressman so and so, his district makes this particular plane or this particular weapon system, we're going to keep doing that. And so you're not approaching it from a strategic standpoint or a national interest standpoint. Many of these members of Congress and the companies that benefit are certainly the profit incentive, the election incentive, and so that is the absolute wrong way to do national security and foreign policy. And kind of the other side of this that I wish people would talk about more is just the cost of everything. So if you look at what not only what we're spending to arm folks in foreign countries, but also the destructiveness of war, kind of going back to just looking at history. War is extremely destructive. It's not, as some people have argued, the thing that got us out of the Depression or the thing that's going to lift people out of poverty and give them jobs. It's sort of it's an economic fallacy to say that. No, war is a destructive thing. It kills people, it breaks things, it leads to less prosperity, it leads to wealth destruction, not creation. Though that temporary kind of increase in economic activity is make work. It's not efficient. It's not the market allocating scarce resources to do productive things. It's destructive. And again, if you look at our history, even with good intentions, sometimes good intentions, sometimes bad intentions, American foreign policy is filled with examples of where things failed because foreign policy is messy. It doesn't usually work out very well. Certainly occupations, haven't worked out well in our history. And there's countless examples of that over the last, 120, 130 years in particular. So I just think we need to be very thoughtful about that. And, my final point is just that with a country that's now $30 trillion in debt, that's another reason to be very cautious about what we do when it comes to foreign policy. What do you think about that?
No, I agree 100%. Now, Brandon, you mentioned earlier the magazine. So why don't you go ahead and plug that and what's happening in Orlando here in about a week or so now?
Yeah, we're really excited. We've got the American Revolution magazine, which is our first edition, coming out, actually hitting mailboxes right now. So it's kind of an opportunity for Young Americans for Liberty to talk about who we are, what we do, to highlight some of our staff, to highlight some of our key legislators who are doing fantastic work in state capitals across the country, pushing for things like defend the guard, school choice, gun rights, tax reform, spending restraint, spending cuts. Across the board, a lot of our legislators are working really hard. So we highlight them. We also talk about a lot of our programs, whether it's campus programs or work on public policy, fighting, speech codes, all sorts of great stuff that YAL is doing. One of the great things that we're doing is actually, as you said, next week in Orlando, August 4th through 6th, we're hosting our annual student conference called Revolution 2022. We've got nearly 1,000 students registered and attending that event. It's in Orlando, and we are sold out actually. But if you're still interested in attending, you can sign up and get on the wait list. And if a spot becomes available, then you might be able to attend. Otherwise, we'll definitely look forward to having you next year.
All right. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming on the show today, Brandon. I appreciate you guys tuning in, and we'll see you next time.